My mother never invited me for dinner. Not in the 5 years since I'd been married to David. Not once. So when her text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing insurance claims at my desk, the simple message felt like a trap waiting to spring. Come for dinner Thursday, just us. Something important to discuss. No warm pleasantries, no casual invitation, just the kind of direct communication that had always made our relationship feel more like a business transaction than a mother-daughter bond. I stared at the message for a full minute before responding with a simple, okay, though every instinct told me to decline. The drive to her house in Riverside took 43 minutes through evening traffic, giving me plenty of time to wonder what this was really about. My mother, Catherine Walsh, had never been the type to cook elaborate meals or create cozy family moments. After my father died when I was 16, she'd retreated into a world of practical efficiency, where emotions were inconvenient interruptions to the business of living. She worked as a hospital administrator, managed her finances with military precision, and treated relationships like contracts with clearly defined terms and expectations. When I'd announced my engagement to David 3 years ago, her response had been a nod and a question about whether we'd registered at practical stores for our wedding gifts. David had always found her coldness amusing rather than hurtful, which I suppose was one of the reasons I'd fallen for him. Where I saw rejection and distance, he saw an interesting puzzle to solve. He was a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital, the kind of man who could make crying toddlers laugh within minutes, and who approached every relationship challenge with patience and genuine curiosity. When my mother would deliver one of her characteristically blunt observations about our life choices, David would simply smile and ask follow-up questions that somehow managed to soften her edges without making her feel manipulated. It was a skill I'd never mastered, and honestly, I'd stopped trying after years of feeling like I was performing in a play where I'd never been given the script. As I pulled into her driveway, I noticed she'd planted new roses along the walkway. Red ones, which struck me as uncharacteristically romantic for someone who usually chose practical shrubs that required minimal maintenance. The house itself looked exactly as it had for the past decade, a modest 2-story colonial painted in sensible beige with black shutters, landscaping that whispered respectability rather than creativity. But those roses felt like a message I couldn't decode, a splash of passion in a life that had always prioritized restraint over expression. She answered the door wearing an apron over her usual uniform of pressed slacks and a cardigan, which immediately raised my suspicions. My mother didn't cook. She heated. She assembled. She arranged pre-made items on plates with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. But the smell drifting from the kitchen suggested actual cooking had occurred, the kind of layered aromas that come from hours of careful preparation rather than microwave efficiency. "You're exactly on time," she said, which was both a compliment and an observation about my predictable nature. "Come in. Everything's almost ready." The dining room table had been set with her good china, the wedding pattern she'd inherited from her own mother, and used maybe twice since I'd known her. Cloth napkins, actual wine glasses, even a small arrangement of those same red roses in a crystal vase I'd never seen before. It felt like walking into someone else's house, or perhaps into a version of my childhood home that had existed only in my imagination. "This is beautiful, Mom," I said, meaning it, but also feeling slightly unnerved by the effort she'd clearly invested in this evening. "I made your favorite," she said, though I wasn't sure what she thought my favorite was. We'd never had enough shared meals for her to have gathered that kind of intimate knowledge about my preferences. But as she brought out the dishes, I realized she'd somehow remembered details I'd forgotten sharing. The lasagna recipe I'd mentioned loving from my college roommate's mother, the Caesar salad with extra croutons, even the specific brand of garlic bread I'd once said reminded me of a restaurant David and I had enjoyed on our honeymoon. It was the kind of thoughtful menu planning that suggested she'd been paying attention to conversations I'd assumed she'd been mentally cataloging as irrelevant small talk. We ate in relative silence for the first 20 minutes, the kind of comfortable quiet that had never existed between us before. She asked about my work at the insurance company, and I found myself actually explaining the complexities of processing disability claims rather than giving my usual abbreviated responses. She told me about a new efficiency program she was implementing at the hospital, and for once I didn't feel like she was lecturing me about the importance of professional advancement. It felt almost normal, this thing we were doing, this approximation of the relationship other people seem to have with their mothers. But I could sense something building beneath the surface of our pleasant conversation, a tension that grew stronger with each course. She kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and calculation. When she brought out dessert, homemade apple pie with vanilla ice cream, I knew we'd reached the real reason for this invitation. My mother didn't make pie from scratch. She barely made coffee from scratch. This entire evening had been an elaborate setup for whatever she was about to tell me, and the sweetness of the dessert suddenly tasted like an apology served in advance. She waited until I'd taken my third bite of pie before leaning across the table, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Don't trust your husband," she said, the words hitting me like cold water. I set down my fork, my hand trembling slightly, and stared at her face for any sign that this was some kind of twisted joke or test. But her expression remained deadly serious, her gray eyes fixed on mine with an intensity I'd rarely seen from her. "What did you just say?" I asked, though I'd heard her perfectly clearly. "You heard me, Jennifer. David isn't who you think he is." The rational part of my mind immediately began constructing defenses. This was my mother, the woman who'd never approved of any choice I'd made, finally finding a way to undermine the one relationship in my life that actually brought me joy. David was kind, patient, beloved by his patients and colleagues. He came home every night, shared his day with me, made me laugh when work had been particularly frustrating. He was the opposite of every negative assumption my mother had ever made about the men I dated, which was probably why she'd never warmed to him. He didn't fit her narrative about my poor judgment or tendency to settle for less than I deserved, but something in her tone stopped me from immediately dismissing her words. This wasn't the calculating coldness I was used to from her, the way she delivered criticism like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. There was urgency in her voice, almost desperation, as if she were trying to warn me about an oncoming truck I was too distracted to see. "Mom, what are you talking about? David is the most honest person I know." She shook her head, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it frightened me more than her words had. 3 months ago, I was at the hospital late finishing quarterly reports when I saw him in the parking lot, she began, her voice still kept deliberately low. It was past midnight, well after his shift ended, and he was with someone, a woman I didn't recognize. They were arguing about something and she was crying. At first I thought maybe it was a colleague having some kind of crisis. You know how he is with people who are upset. But then I saw him give her money, Jennifer. A lot of money. Cash. In an envelope. I pulled my hand away from hers, feeling defensive anger building in my chest. So he was helping someone. That's exactly the kind of thing David would do. He's generous, Mom. It's one of the things I love about him. But even as I said it, I was thinking about the unexplained cash withdrawals I'd noticed in our joint account over the past few months. David had mentioned something about helping his brother with temporary financial difficulties, and I'd never questioned it, because David's family had always been close and supportive of each other. I thought the same thing initially, my mother continued, but something about the interaction bothered me. The way they were standing, the way she touched his arm when she took the money. It didn't look like charity, Jennifer. It looked personal. So I started paying attention. She paused to take a sip of wine, and I noticed her hand wasn't entirely steady either. I work in hospital administration. I have access to employee schedules, parking records, security footage. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems that didn't exist because I've never trusted my own judgment about people's motives. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was exactly the kind of behavior I'd expect from my mother. Suspicious, invasive, unable to believe that someone might genuinely care about me without hidden agendas. But there was something in her demeanor that kept me listening, rather than walking out. She seemed genuinely reluctant to be telling me this, as if each word was causing her physical pain. This wasn't the satisfaction of being right that I'd seen from her so many times before. This was the expression of someone delivering news she desperately wished wasn't true. "What did you find?" I asked, hating myself for encouraging her but unable to stop myself from wanting to know. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, the kind she used for administrative paperwork at the hospital. Security footage from the employee parking lot over the past 3 months. David's car, license plate clearly visible, parked in spots that aren't assigned to him during times when he wasn't scheduled to work. Always meeting the same woman, always passing something between them. Sometimes money, sometimes documents I couldn't identify from the camera angle. She opened the folder and spread out printed screenshots across the table. and my heart sank as I recognized David's distinctive blue Honda Civic in each image. The timestamps showed meetings at odd hours: 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, 11:43 p.m. on a Friday, 6:22 a.m. on a Sunday morning. In each photo, there was a woman with long, dark hair, whose face was partially obscured by the camera angle, but whose body language suggested familiarity and intimacy with my husband. They weren't touching romantically, but there was something in their posture that spoke of shared secrets and ongoing deception. "Who is she?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. My mother shook her head, looking genuinely frustrated for the first time in our conversation. "I've been trying to figure that out for weeks. She doesn't work at our hospital, and she's not in any of the employee databases I have access to. But Jennifer, there's something else. Something that made me decide I had to tell you tonight, regardless of how much it might hurt our relationship." She pulled out another set of papers, bank statements with highlighted sections that made my stomach drop even before I understood what I was looking at. "These are copies of withdrawal records from the ATM in our hospital lobby," my mother said, pointing to the highlighted entries. "David has been taking out cash there regularly, always in amounts just under the reporting threshold. $800 here, $900 there. Never quite enough to trigger automatic fraud alerts. But when you add it up over 3 months, Jennifer, he's withdrawn over $12,000 from your joint account, always during these late-night meetings." The numbers swam in front of my eyes as I tried to process what she was showing me. $12,000. That was more than we'd spent on our entire honeymoon, more than we'd saved for the down payment on our house upgrade we'd been planning. I thought about all the times David had mentioned his brother needing help, all the casual explanations about family obligations and temporary financial assistance. But $12,000 wasn't temporary help. $12,000 was the kind of money that suggested ongoing responsibility or serious trouble. "Maybe his brother's situation is worse than he told me," I said weakly, grasping for innocent explanations, even as the evidence in front of me painted an increasingly damning picture. "Maybe he didn't want to worry me with the details." My mother's expression softened slightly, the first genuine sympathy I'd seen from her in years. "I hoped it was something like that too, but I called his brother last week, Jennifer. I told him I was considering making a charitable donation to help with medical expenses, something vague that wouldn't reveal what I suspected. Michael had no idea what I was talking about. He's been employed steadily, his family is healthy, and he hasn't asked David for money in over 2 years. The last piece of my desperate denial crumbled as she spoke. David had been lying to me for months, creating elaborate stories to cover up regular cash withdrawals for purposes I couldn't begin to imagine. "There's more," my mother continued, and I wanted to tell her to stop, that I'd heard enough, that some truths were too destructive to be spoken aloud. But I sat frozen as she pulled out the final set of documents from her folder. Hospital security badges are programmed to track entry and exit times for insurance and safety purposes. David's badge shows him entering areas of the hospital where he doesn't work, areas that require special clearance, the pharmacy, medical records, administrative offices, always during overnight shifts when minimal staff would be present to notice someone where they shouldn't be. The implication hit me like a physical blow. David wasn't just meeting some mysterious woman and lying about financial help for his brother. He was potentially involved in something criminal, something that required access to controlled substances or confidential patient information. My husband, the man who sang silly songs to frighten children and stayed late to comfort worried parents, was apparently living a double life that involved deception on multiple levels. "I don't understand," I whispered, though part of me was beginning to understand all too clearly. "Neither do I," my mother admitted, "but I know it's serious enough that I couldn't keep quiet about it anymore. I've been debating whether to tell you for weeks, going back and forth about whether I was protecting you or destroying your happiness over suspicions that might be wrong. But when I saw him badge into the controlled pharmacy storage at 3 a.m. last Tuesday, I knew I couldn't wait any longer to warn you." She reached across the table again, her hand covering mine with surprising warmth. "I love you, Jennifer. I know I'm not good at showing it, and I know you have every reason to think I'm interfering in your life because I can't accept your happiness. But this isn't about my opinion of David. This is about protecting you from something that could destroy your life if it goes wrong." I stared at the evidence spread across her dining room table, trying to reconcile the man I shared a bed with every night with the person described in these security reports and bank statements. David, who brought me coffee in bed on weekend mornings. David, who patiently listened to my complaints about difficult insurance claims. David, who had proposed to me on the beach, where we'd had our first date, because he remembered I'd said it was the most peaceful place I'd ever been. How could someone capable of that kind of thoughtfulness and romance also be capable of systematic deception and potentially criminal behavior? "What do you think I should do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. It felt strange to be asking my mother for relationship advice, this woman who had maintained emotional distance from me for most of my adult life. But she was also the most practical person I knew, someone who approached problems with methodical analysis rather than emotional reaction. If anyone could help me navigate this situation rationally, it would be her. "I think you need to protect yourself legally and financially before you confront him," she said without hesitation. "Document everything I've shown you tonight. Move money from your joint accounts into personal accounts he can't access, and consider contacting a lawyer who specializes in criminal defense." The word criminal made everything feel surreal, like we were discussing someone else's life rather than my own. 2 hours ago, my biggest concern had been whether to order new business cards after my recent promotion at work. Now I was contemplating the possibility that my husband was involved in activities that could result in arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment. "I can't just assume the worst," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew I was trying to convince myself rather than her. "Maybe there's an explanation that makes sense of all this." My mother nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. "Maybe there is. But Jennifer, even if David has an innocent explanation for everything I've discovered, the fact remains that he's been lying to you for months about significant financial transactions and his activities during times when you thought he was sleeping next to you. That level of deception, regardless of the underlying reasons, suggests problems in your relationship that you need to address honestly." I drove home in a daze, my mother's evidence folder sitting on the passenger seat like an unexploded bomb. Every traffic light gave me another moment to process what I'd learned, and by the time I pulled into our driveway, I felt like I was returning to a house belonging to strangers. David's car was in its usual spot, and I could see the warm glow of our living room lamp through the front window. Such an ordinary scene of domestic tranquility, completely at odds with the turmoil churning in my mind. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to decide how to handle the conversation that was about to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. When I finally walked inside, David was exactly where I'd expected to find him, stretched out on the couch in his scrubs and socks, watching a cooking show and scrolling through his phone. He looked up with the same warm smile that had made me fall in love with him, completely unaware that I was seeing him with entirely new eyes. "How was dinner with your mom?" he asked, muting the television. That was unusually social of her. "Did she finally decide to approve of your life choices?" His tone was teasing and affectionate, the same gentle humor he'd always used when discussing my mother's emotional distance. "It was enlightening," I said carefully, settling into the armchair across from him, rather than my usual spot curled against his side on the couch. Something in my tone must have alerted him that this wasn't going to be our typical evening recap, because his expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. "David, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I watched his face for micro-expressions, the kinds of subtle changes that might reveal guilt or fear, but he simply nodded with the same patient openness he'd always shown when I had concerns to discuss. "Of course. What's going on?" he said, setting his phone aside completely. I took a deep breath and decided to start with the most concrete question, the one that would be hardest for him to deflect or rationalize. "Why have you been withdrawing large amounts of cash from our joint account without discussing it with me? And please don't tell me it's for your brother, because I know that isn't true." I watched his face carefully, looking for the moment when his expression would shift from confusion to recognition to defensiveness. Instead, his shoulders sagged with what looked like relief, as if he'd been carrying a heavy burden and was grateful to finally set it down. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry you found out this way. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks, but every time I started to explain, I realized how terrible it was going to sound." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make hundreds of times when he was stressed or trying to organize his thoughts. "The money isn't for anything illegal or dishonest. It's for my ex-wife." The words hit me like a slap. "Your ex-wife? David, you told me you'd never been married before." I felt the ground shifting beneath me as another fundamental assumption about my husband crumbled. We'd had extensive conversations about our relationship histories, and he'd been clear that while he'd had several serious long-term relationships, he'd never been married. It was one of the things that had made our wedding feel so special, the belief that we were both experiencing marriage for the first time together. "I know what I told you, and I know how this sounds," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "But I was married very briefly when I was 23, right after nursing school. It lasted less than a year, and it ended so badly that I convinced myself it didn't really count. Sarah has severe bipolar disorder, and during our marriage, she accumulated massive debts during manic episodes. Credit cards, loans, even money borrowed from dangerous people. When we divorced, I thought I was free from all of that. But apparently some of her creditors consider me legally responsible for debts she incurred while we were married." I stared at him, trying to process this explanation against everything my mother had shown me. "So, the woman you've been meeting with is your ex-wife?" He nodded, looking genuinely ashamed. "She contacted me about 6 months ago saying that some of her creditors were threatening legal action that could affect both of us. I've been trying to help her pay off the most dangerous debts before they escalate into something that could impact our credit or our safety. I know I should have told you from the beginning, but I was so ashamed of having lied about being married before, and I didn't want you to worry about financial problems that weren't really ours." The explanation was plausible, even sympathetic, but something about it didn't align with what I'd observed in my mother's security footage. "David, if that's true, why have you been meeting her at the hospital in the middle of the night? And why does your security badge show you accessing areas where you don't work?" His expression shifted then, a flash of something that might have been panic before he regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about with the security badge stuff. And the meetings at the hospital happen at odd hours, because that's when Sarah's schedule allows it. She works nights at a cleaning service." But I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the careful calculation of someone trying to decide how much truth to reveal and how much to continue concealing. This was the moment when I realized that regardless of whether his explanation about the ex-wife was true, there were still layers of deception I hadn't uncovered. My mother had been right to warn me, even if she hadn't understood the complete picture of what David was hiding. "I think we need to take a break from this conversation," I said, standing up from the chair. "I need some time to process everything you've told me, and I think you need time to decide whether you're ready to be completely honest with me about what's been going on." David started to protest, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm going to stay at my mother's house tonight. When I come back tomorrow, I want the whole truth, David. All of it. Because what you've told me so far doesn't explain everything I know, and I can't build a marriage on partial truths and convenient omissions." As I packed an overnight bag, I realized that my mother's warning had done more than reveal my husband's deceptions. It had shown me that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for, capable of demanding honesty, even when the truth might destroy everything I'd built. For the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely grateful for my mother's analytical coldness and protective instincts. Tomorrow would bring more difficult conversations and painful discoveries, but tonight I was safe in the knowledge that someone had cared enough to warn me before it was too late.